Covert DNA collection, human genetic modification, biohacking, gene editing, bio-weaponry. It's all going on around us every day, but most of us know nothing about this shadowy world of genetics. From myself, Mark L. Watson, this is Double Helix. We've dug in some depth over the course of this podcast into some of the concerns that we should have around certain modern scientific advancements should they fall into the wrong hands or be handled in a way which does not conform to current standards of ethics and the law. We've certainly touched on some of the damage that can be done when genetics becomes the plaything of the wild and unregulated, whether that's an individual or a state. But what if the very nature of human genetics was used as the main proponent in something far more malicious? Something that's designed to harm or kill vast swathes of a population? What I'm referring to here is commonly called a bioweapon. The history of biological warfare goes back hundreds of years, though taking differing forms over time. In the year 1155, Roman Emperor Barbarossa plunged dead and decaying human corpses into the wells in order to poison the drinking water of the inhabitants of Tortona in Italy as part of his campaign to take power of Rome and to take over the empire. A couple of hundred years later, the Mongol hordes took siege of Kaffa in what's now Crimea and launched the bodies of those who died of the plague over the walls of the city. An act which contributed greatly to the Black Death, wiping out between a third and a half of the population of Europe. By the time we reached the First World War, research was well underway into how to send specific viruses and diseases over enemy lines by any delivery means possible. The Geneva Protocol of 1925 prohibited the use of biological and chemical weaponry, but the research continued. And by the end of the Second World War, there existed a plethora of bioweapons which could readily release anything from the plague and sleeping sickness to various zoonosis diseases which could infect humans and animals alike. So from poison-tipped arrows to plague-filled explosives, mankind has always sought one method or another to gain the upper hand on the battlefield in abhorrent biological ways. But dropping explosives from a plane which contain viruses or toxins is a rather scorched earth tactic. Anyone who should be in the way of the release of the toxin or virus would be affected. The distribution of the agent would be subject to numerous external and often impossible to predict factors. The wind direction if the agent was airborne, the spread of water into rivers and streams if the agent should be carried that way. It may affect, injure, kill if that was the intention, any number of civilians, children, the innocent, those caught in the crossfire of war or terrorism. So there is, in this hopefully hypothetical scenario, a requirement for the tailoring, a refining of the targeting parameters. And so, enter the ethno-weapon, or the biogenic weapon, if you'd prefer. Imagine if the nerve agent, or the virus, or the toxin contained within a weapon, whether it's a bomb or a smaller targeted device, or even just a handheld spray, could be designed to only affect certain individuals. The notion was recently part of the plot of a Bond movie, and such is its fantastical nature and quite absurdity, but it's rooted in truth and in science. Let me explain. Each of us has our own genetic makeup, making each one of us on the planet individual in many different ways. But there are also a great many genetic points which cross within each of us. Indeed, we all share 99.9% of our genetic code with each other, everyone on the planet. Any differences between us have, ultimately at one stage, resulted from tiny mutations in the DNA. It doesn't leave many differences in that 0.1% of the DNA, but as I said in a past episode, you share 44% of your genetic makeup with a banana, so there is enough scope. Everything about you that makes you different from me is all squeezed into that 0.1%. Research has repeatedly shown that things such as a person's race or ethnic background don't even particularly show as evident at a genetic level. But there are still very slight differences which have been brought on over the lifespan of the human, between people from different parts of the world, from different backgrounds. And so the concept of the biogenic weapon is that an agent could be developed to target only a very certain genetic trait. It could then, hypothetically speaking, be released into a wider public, whether in the air or the water or wherever, and it could have absolutely no effect on anyone other than those with the set genetic difference or the genetic trait. Dropped onto the battlefield to poison the enemy, but not your own army, for example. Or, stretching it just a little further, closer into the realms of science fiction, but, and we'll hear soon, a perfectly attainable and plausible goal, would be to have all your own people take an antidote or similar ahead of time before the weapon's discharged, rendering only them safe from the effects. And to push that envelope just that little bit further, it could be engineered to simply target a single person, an individual, based on their own genetic code. The Atlantic put out an editorial back in 2012 telling us how this exact thing is not only possible, but an active concern of US national security and likely other nations too. The article presents a hypothetical scenario whereby a university campus is infected with a flu-like virus, making some of the students a little ill and able to cough and sneeze the virus around the university, but otherwise nobody would feel too bad from it. The virus, intentionally leaked and spread, would react in a very certain way to the standard DNA structure of any human. But should it cross paths with a different, very specific structure of DNA, say one that belongs to a very specific person, then the virus would react very differently, and perhaps in a more fatal manner. Then say, the article hypothesizes, that the president was due to give a speech that day or that week at the university. Say it was his DNA that the virus had been designed to take aim at. Well, then you see where this goes. It goes some considerable distance, therefore, to explain why the USA, and again likely many other nations too, go to great lengths to protect the president's DNA from ever being spread, left anywhere public, and ultimately ending up in the wrong nefarious hands. If you've ever been in the presence of the US president and his entourage of security personnel, you'd have seen them collecting his water glasses when he's finished with them. When he visits a school or a hospital and handles something that belongs to the building, it's promptly swooped up when he's done. Each morning his bed is stripped by authorized staff, his clothes carefully collected and laundered. I'm sure they're not collecting each lost hair when he's on public engagements, but you can be sure they're doing their best to. It shows that the US government is acutely aware of the risks of letting someone, a rogue terror cell or a foreign power, for example, get their hands on the president's DNA. Given that the aforementioned bioweaponry is actually closer to truth and real science than to just sci-fi, and given the lengths that some foreign states are clearly willing to go to, it's probably better to be safe than sorry. What technology and what intent other nations may have is a source for speculation, but the US are clearly aware of what can theoretically be done. even if it's to employ such techniques themselves. A WikiLeaks document dump a few years back showed a directive from then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton sent out to US diplomats across the African continent, asking them to collect not only the biographical information that they usually collect on all individuals that they speak to, but also, quote, fingerprints, facial images, DNA, and iris scans. The targets of the collection were classified as, quote, key civilian and military officials, end quote, in line with current practices that are operated in Iran and Afghanistan. Though a year later, another memo was sent out to overseas US diplomats, requesting that the same be done in China, Cuba, Egypt, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Pakistan, South Africa, Sudan, Uganda, Senegal, and Syria, along with any high-ranking North Koreans that anyone should come into contact with. Clearly, as the Atlantic article writes, quote, the US sees strategic advantage in knowing the specific biology of world leaders. It would be surprising if other nations didn't feel the same. There aren't, though, as it stands, many pathogens which fit the brief to be used as bioweapons. Anthrax is probably the best known, and it's nearly entirely treatable within a few days with simple modern medicines. But a few little genetic tweaks, and things can be very different. Many of these viruses, including things like smallpox, are heavily regulated and guarded. Indeed, smallpox is only known to exist in 2 facilities, one in the USA and one in Russia. But with such rapid developments in genetic and biology, it's surely only a matter of time before such things are finally discovered, or unleashed. Much of the technology for constructing them or for turning them into biological weapons already exists. It's currently in place in numerous biotech facilities. Again, it's probably only a matter of time before we see some intentional release of a virus or a pathogen, used either on the battlefield en masse or against a certain unlucky targeted individual. We know that the world's leading biotech facilities and genetics labs likely already possess the capabilities to create biogenic weapons, and we trust in the ethics of their management that such things will remain secure behind locked doors and not be unleashed on the public anywhere in the world. For years, a small handful of facilities have been the only ones with the knowledge, equipment, and necessary funds to undertake such creative experiments. But the landscape has changed, and a new community has sprung up and taken a foothold in the world of biological research. Whilst not an entirely new concept, should you care to trace it to its roots, the world of biohacking has grown tenfold in the past few years. The more catch-all name, the umbrella term, is DIY biology or DIY science if you want to expand outwards even further. It's a rather generic name given to any small group or even individual who studies a science with very little training and experience and education, who then goes on to mentor and work with others with even less official training or experience or education. It can be simply as a hobby, or for experimenting and innovating, or even for business purposes. The practices which these citizen scientists undertake are, theoretically, still subject to the same laws, regulations, and restrictions as those carried out in any laboratory. But with biohacking labs springing up all over the world, especially in Europe, the scope for freedom of experimentation is huge. They answer to themselves, and they're taking risks to which no government research facility would dare. Biohackers research all scientific disciplines, and much of it can be very beneficial. Indeed, there's a growing market for biohacked wellness products such as weight loss and skincare. The industry, once punk and underground, is now making strides into the mainstream and turning a huge profit. But of course, the possibility for error, the possibility for mistake, of going too far with experimentation, is greater in an industry which largely regulates itself. There are very few things to stop you from buying a load of equipment and starting your own basement genetics lab. It's not safe, and it's not advised, but you can pretty much do what you please. Welcome to the world of biohacking and genetic engineering. A great deal of very warranted concern around biohacking has been a worry that some virus or pathogen or disease may be created under the radar and released, whether intentionally or not. But our focus here is on genetics, and trust me, there's plenty of concern there too. There's a paper from the National Library of Medicine which summarizes this all very neatly. It says, and I quote, "Experiments to modify genetic expression that once required specialized training and substantial investments in equipment can now be conducted for a few $100s. It goes on to say genomic sequencing can be done using portable pocket devices, and the rise of direct-to-consumer genetics testing has also resulted in individual access to raw genetic data." So as these technologies go mainstream, some individuals have begun conducting genetic experiments outside of traditional scientific labs, such as those associated with universities, research institutions, and regulated corporate entities. Some of these experiments have involved humans, although thus far they appear to be limited to self-experimentation with one's own body. The motivations of these genetic biohackers, some of whom lack any formal training in biology whatsoever, are diverse and often quite complex. Some appear to be motivated by normative beliefs in a right to do science. Others place a high value on bodily autonomy or creative expression, a right to experiment on themselves and use genome editing for expressive purposes. Some view biohacking as a means of self-care, where, for example, they experiment with alternatives to, sometimes quite expensive, regulated drugs. Still others harbour views that traditional scientific institutions are poor regulators of themselves and are slow and needlessly cumbersome. And then there's some, frankly, who are moved by anti-government sentiments. The necessary government oversight and regulation is, whatever they may claim, largely lacking or even entirely absent. Where organised scientific institutions, whether public or privately managed, need to obtain ethical and practical review of their work before any of it can be published or released, perhaps with some small exceptions. We're looking back at you, China. Biohackers don't need or even want any of that. That said, the world of biohacking does not exist in its own lawless bubble. It falls under the same legal guidelines and laws that everything else does. In the US, for example, most of the component parts of an experiment, such as any biological material or other chemicals, or even the DIY CRISPR kits that we were speaking about, all fall under the restrictive legislation set out by the FDA. Though to date, the FDA has not enforced its legislation against a single entity or individual in relation to biohacking. And so, the world has opened itself up to DIY homebrew genetic engineering. We only need to look back to Joe Zahner, who we heard a little about in episode 4, using the CRISPR home kits to inject himself with all sorts of things. Whether in the name of science, art, or pure anarchy, the world is his oyster. Until, of course, he goes too far with it. So where have we been left with everything, with all of this? There's a lot to take in, and trust me, as someone who's spent the past few months researching and writing on the subject, trawling through legal papers and medical council advisories and even governmental inquiries, I can tell you, we could have turned this into a 40-episode show. I began back in the first episode talking with you about DNA collection about the huge genetic databases, and about the Chinese persecution of their own people. It was nearly impossible to do any form of justice to the issues raised therein whilst keeping it to a manageable length for a recording. There's an endless amount of fascinating and often very horrific information which has been released into the public sphere already. I urge you all, if you have any interest in any of this, anything that I've been saying, and at least you've made it here to episode 6, please read more about it for yourselves. I asked all my guests where they thought things stood in relation to their fields of study and expertise. Is the future a golden one, a bright beacon that we can head towards keenly, with excitement and hope? Or are we on a dangerous and dark path into the unknown? I put the question first to James Clapper. What do you think is the next step? What do you think is the future of this? Do you think this is something that the US, for example, from your own experience, have a handle on? Or do you think that more can be done to control it?
Well, I think we have when you say we have a handle on it, I think we have a pretty good understanding of what the Chinese do. If you mean we have a handle on it, that we're successful in preventing it, no.
Scary stuff.
Well, I don't think it is scary. I think it's just an acknowledgement of reality. The Russians, all the autocratic states, the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans particularly, and Iranians, these autocracies attempt to segregate the internet to keep the Western forms of the internet out of their countries. And so I think we just need to acknowledge that's the way it's going to be. And a global internet with a transparency and sharing of information and promote the best interest of mankind is, which I think was what motivated the founding fathers and mothers of the internet. Well, that isn't going to work, and I think we ought to give up trying to make it work that way. It's what I said at the outset, that they focus on what they think are our strengths, and they seek vulnerabilities. So the reason they have a very, very aggressive counter space program, which is designed to go after what they know we rely heavily on, which is space. They have an array of weapon systems designed to kill carriers, and they're probably pretty effective, and we don't have much of an antidote for them. So I think, they approach this by analyzing what they think they need to do to compensate for what we believe are our strengths, and it's actually a pretty smart approach. I will say that the Chinese are not 10 feet tall. They have, for example, one issue people don't focus on very much is a serious demographic challenge the Chinese have, where their cohort of older, non-productive people like me is growing. And increasingly, productivity in China is dependent upon a shrinking cohort of young people. And they have, as this older cohort grows, they will be more demanding of social services, social security, medical support, and all that. And the Chinese economy is cooling. They've had tremendous challenge with their approach to COVID. So they're not, and plus their reproduction policy of many years is coming back to haunt them now.
Yeah.
So they've got some serious challenges to confront that I think will affect their grand design for global influence.
The restrictions of this podcast must keep it to a length where I won't lose your interest, and our main aim of releasing it is to inform you, the everyday listener, who may have no previous interest in any of this. To inform you of what's going on around the world that you may not have known about before, and which we think it's important that more people do know. But in doing that, we must be brief. We must give you the facts and the headlines, paint a clear picture, and make it easy to digest. After all, many of you will be listening whilst driving or working out or going about your daily tasks. But there's so much more out there that you should know about which just couldn't make the cut for this show. The concerns around what's going on behind those locked doors of BGI are deep and only getting deeper. The ongoing Uyghur genocide shows their continued disregard for international law, whether scientific or medical or otherwise. I also put the question to Sophie Richardson from Human Rights Watch. Where does she see the future going? As we look at these next few years, what hope is there for us, for the West, for the world, in contending and competing with the likes of the Chinese on this global genetic battlefield?
Well, I think the Chinese government has a disturbing head start in how it uses this technology for the purposes of control across the country, and with a clear goal of making every single individual more legible to the state. And I wish I could be more optimistic about the possibilities that some of the institutions that could mitigate those harms, a free press, an independent judiciary, respect for independent activists, was on the near-term horizon. But I think we've watched Beijing systematically weaken, if not destroy, those institutions. And the net effect is that you have an extremely powerful, affluent, very ambitious and disciplined government using this technology in ways that profoundly undermine and violate human rights across the country. But I think there's a huge amount of work to be done in understanding and taking, actual policy measures that would, at a minimum, constrain the Chinese government's ability to use this kind of technology, in ways that I think have pretty horrifying consequences. The evidence of the abuses is clear. What we need is a lot more energy and willingness to help generate solutions.
During the production of this podcast, the US announced that it had banned the sale and import of all communications equipment from 5 different Chinese companies, including Huawei and ZTE, amid concerns over national security. They believe that the tech is designed to infringe on personal data, collect it even, and feed it all systematically back into the red claws of the Chinese government. We didn't even include that story in the show as it veered too far away from our focus on genetics. But it's just another example of how, even today, the Chinese are going to all measures to invade our national security and civil liberties. The free world, as we call it, can try, and it does, to get a handle on what's going on, to keep back invading technologies and to stop the Chinese getting their hands on your data. But there's nothing any nation can do, save from perhaps all-out warfare, to stop them from conducting their own business on their own soil. We know of the atrocities, but we can just sit helpless. Meanwhile, the Chinese military budget goes into anti-satellite technology so that even if warfare does one day come, they will disable an entire satellite array before any warship or jet gets anywhere near their shores. We need not be concerned about such things, but likewise ignore them at your peril. Like a fraudster or a hacker, they're always thinking another step ahead of the cops trying to catch them. You disable one method, and they simply start on the next. The future of genetic engineering, on the other hand, looks incredibly bright, and the advances made in the past decade will pave the way for revolutionary new procedures to take place more and more freely.
Tammy, you excited for the future of all of this? Does the future look bright?
We're going to see a lot of new gene therapies, but like any kind of medicine, they come with side effects, they come with trade-offs. And in terms of like deciding what the good genes are for the future, like good luck. There's been a lot of attention to intelligence. It turns out that that's mediated by so many different genes that's going to be impossible to invest in a Harvard education or an Oxford education. I'm not, just championing my brand here, but like higher education is a much better way to, have an intelligent child than trying to engineer it. Even if you wanted to create a tall child, there's 180 genes involved in height. And that only explains, I'd say maybe about 60% of height. So you really want a tall kid, like feed them bovine growth hormone. Like that's going to be a much quicker, time-tested way to produce a huge kid. But yeah, so many of these things are a subtle interplay between your social experiences, your environment, the biology that you inherit, whether that's genetic or epigenetic. That I think it's very difficult to reduce any of this to genetic determinism. Some traits like blue eyes, light skin, blonde hair give you social advantages. You're much less likely to get shot by a police officer in the US or the UK or, in Indonesia, for example, if you have a certain phenotype, if your skin is a certain color, if your hair looks a certain way. So there's possibly going to be intense social pressures for people who can afford it to modify their children. But that's if we decide as a society to permit these kinds of technologies in the reproductive clinic. So yeah, I think, there are concrete medical applications of gene therapies, and I'll but celebrate these new cancer innovations. I just wish equity could be built into them. But I think ultimately society is going to have to make some eugenic decisions. Are we going to open up this to the individual parent, to the individual doctor, to decide what a good gene or a bad gene is? Or do we want to say that certain things are better left to chance? It's a hard call.
As Eben Kirksey said, the main area of focus needs to be on making such things available to us all instead of just a wealthy minority. It will take time, but the road there is being laid as we speak, and we'll hopefully be able to walk it by the time our babies have grown up. Double Helix was written and produced by myself, Mark Watson. Sound design is produced with credit to Looperman and Pixabay. I'd like to thank everyone who contributed to the show, and to all my guests who kindly gave up time from their busy schedules to speak with us. And I'd like to thank you too, the listener. Without your support, none of this would be possible. You can find more content and follow my work at marklwatson.co.uk or by searching anywhere online. Thank you for listening, and please go and dig deeper on everything that has been discussed in this show. There is so much more yet to uncover.